The strangest part was not the cold. It was the silence that came before it. I had lived in Ashford, Vermont for 3 years, and I knew what a bad winter sounded like. It groaned through the walls. It knocked over trash cans down the block. It pressed against the windows like something that wanted in. But the night of the storm, the silence came first, a full, heavy, unnatural quiet that sat over the town like a held breath. I remember standing at my kitchen window with a mug of barely warm coffee, staring out at the white nothing beyond my porch light and thinking, this one is going to be different. I was right, just not in any way I could have predicted. My name is Callum Reid. I am 26 years old. I work remotely as a wildlife data analyst, and which means I spend most of my days reading migration patterns and population counts for animals I will probably never see in person. I live alone in a small 2-story house on the edge of town, close enough to the tree line that my neighbors once complained I was asking for trouble. They meant bears. They meant coyotes. They meant the general wilderness that pressed up against the back of my yard like it was waiting for an invitation. They were not wrong. I just never thought I would be the one to answer the door. The storm hit properly around 9 that night. I had already lost power by 8:50. I had candles going, a flashlight on the counter, and a blanket wrapped around my shoulders while I sat on the floor next to my dead laptop trying to read a paperback by candlelight. I was 4 pages in and already annoyed. The wind had shifted from background noise to something personal, something insistent, like it was trying to communicate. And then I heard it, scratching, low, rhythmic. Coming from the back door, I did not move immediately. I sat there and listened, the way you do when you are hoping a sound will explain itself or simply stop. It did neither. It continued steady and soft, like something small dragging its nails down the wood in slow, deliberate strokes. I told myself it was a branch, wind-driven debris against the doorframe. That is what a sensible person tells himself at 9:15 on a night with no power and a storm that has already knocked out half the town's cellular signal. But there was a particular desperation to that sound, a rhythm that was not random. It came and paused and came again, all like something that had learned that doors sometimes opened when you asked them the right way. I pulled the flashlight off the counter and crossed to the back door. What I saw when I opened it should have sent me straight back inside. There was a wolf on my back porch, grey-white, soaked through, barely standing. Its head was low, its legs were shaking, and its eyes caught my flashlight beam and reflected it back at me in a glassy, half-conscious way that made my chest do something uncomfortable. It was not threatening me. It was not baring its teeth. It was just standing there, swaying slightly, in the kind of stillness that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with exhaustion. I said out loud to no one, "You have got to be kidding me." The wolf blinked. I should explain something about myself here. I analyze wildlife data. I count populations. I track migration corridors on spreadsheets. I do not do field work. I have never done field work. I am the person who sits in a heated office and tells the people who do field work what the numbers mean. I am not equipped, trained, or remotely qualified for what I was currently looking at. And yet, I stepped back and I left the door open. The wolf came in slowly, barely clearing the threshold before its legs gave out completely. It collapsed just inside the doorway, its side heaving, breath coming in shallow, visible clouds. I stood 2 feet away from it, holding a flashlight and a blanket I had already been wearing, and I made a decision that was either the most compassionate or most catastrophically stupid thing I had ever done. Probably both. I set the flashlight on the floor. I aimed at the ceiling for ambient light. I filled a pot with water and set it on the gas stove, which thankfully still worked. And then I turned back to the open door. Because the wolf on my floor was not alone. There were more of them in the yard. I counted in that first disbelieving sweep of my flashlight, 4, then 6, then 8, dark shapes against the snow, some moving, some completely still, some pressed together, some stretched out flat and not moving at all. I stood in my open doorway in the middle of a Vermont blizzard, and I looked at 15 half-frozen wolves spread across my backyard, and I had one clear, immediate, completely irrational thought. I am going to need a bigger pot. I pulled my coat off the hook by the door, I put it on over my blanket, and I went outside. The cold hit me like a wall the second I cleared the porch steps. Not the polite kind of cold that nips at your ears and reminds you to wear a hat. This was the kind that had opinions about you. The kind that pushed into your lungs and made your first breath feel like a mistake. The wind was coming from the north, cutting sideways across the yard, and the snow was not falling so much as flying, moving in horizontal sheets that turned my flashlight beam into a wall of white static. I stood at the bottom of my porch steps and took stock of what I was actually dealing with. 15 wolves, spread across approximately 40 feet of open yard. Some were clustered near the tree line, pressed together in groups of 2 or 3. Some were closer, partially visible under the snow that had already begun to settle on their fur. A few were moving, sluggish and uncoordinated, turning slow circles in the way animals do when their bodies are still running on instinct, but their energy is completely gone. And some were not moving at all. Those were the ones I went to first. I crossed the yard in a half-crouch, moving low and slow the way I had read you were supposed to approach injured animals, which felt extremely relevant and also completely insufficient given the current scale of the situation. The nearest still wolf was about 15 feet from the porch, half buried in a drift that had built up against the side of the yard fence. I reached it and crouched beside it and pressed 2 fingers against the side of its throat, the way I had seen done in nature documentaries, which I was now realizing I had apparently been watching in lieu of any actual training. There was a pulse. Faint and slow, but there. "Okay," I said, mostly to myself and slightly to the wolf. "Okay, you are not dead. That is a reasonable starting point." The wolf did not respond, which was appropriate. I got my arms under it. It was heavier than it looked, dense with waterlogged fur, and I had to dig my boots into the snow for traction as I lifted. My lower back immediately filed a formal complaint. I ignored it and started moving toward the house. The other wolves watched me. That was the part that lodged somewhere strange in my chest as I worked. They did not scatter. They did not posture. They tracked me with their eyes as I crossed the yard, carrying one of their own, and there was something in their collective stillness that felt less like fear and more like they were waiting to see if I was worth trusting. No pressure. I got the first wolf inside and laid it as gently as I could on the kitchen floor beside the one that had scratched at the door. I checked the water on the stove. Not boiling yet. I grabbed every towel I owned from the hallway closet, which turned out to be 7 because I was a single man who did not prioritize linen inventory. I laid 3 of them over the wolves already inside and went back out. Trip 2. Trip 3. I stopped counting at some point and just kept moving. By the time I had brought in the ones who could not walk on their own, I had 4 wolves on my kitchen floor, 2 in the hallway, and 1 that had dragged itself through the back door under its own power and was now collapsed in the space between the refrigerator and the wall, which was frankly a logistical problem I would deal with later. The ones who could still move, I tried to guide, which mostly meant standing at my back door and leaving it open and speaking in a low, steady voice while freezing wind poured into my kitchen and the candles on my counter guttered dangerously. Some of them came, some of them needed more convincing. One of them sat down in the middle of my yard and stared at me with the specific energy of someone questioning my credentials. "I'm a data analyst," I told it. "This is already outside my job description. Can you just come inside?" It came inside. I got 10 of them in. The remaining 5 were still mobile enough to cluster together near the fence, and after 3 attempts to herd them toward the door that resulted only in me slipping twice and developing a new and personal grudge against my own boots, I made a different call. I dragged both of my outdoor storage benches against the fence to cut the wind, piled every spare blanket I owned over the gap, and tucked the edges down as tightly as I could. It was not shelter. It was barely an improvement. But it was something, and right now something was all I had. The water was boiling by the time I got back inside. I pulled every pot and bowl I owned and filled them. I mixed the boiling water with cold from the tap until it was warm, not hot, and started working through the wolves on my kitchen floor one by one. Wet fur warmed up faster than I expected. Breathing steadied. Eyes that had been half shut started tracking again. I was on my knees between the stove and the hallway, wringing out a soaked towel over the sink when I felt it. The quality of the room changed. I cannot explain it better than that. The air shifted. The wolves that had been restless went still. The two in the hallway lifted their heads simultaneously toward the back of the room, and I turned to follow their gaze without fully understanding why. There was a wolf in the far corner of the kitchen that I had not brought in. I had not seen it come through the door. I did not know how long it had been there. It was enormous, black, where the others were grey and brown and pale. Its eyes caught the candlelight and reflected back not silver, like the others, but a deep, unmistakable gold. And it was watching me with an attention that felt nothing like an animal. I did not move. That was the first thing my body decided, completely without my input. Every other wolf in that kitchen had arrived looking half destroyed, wet, shaking, barely functional, and this one looked like it had walked through the storm and decided the storm was the one that should be worried. Its fur was soaked, yes. There was ice matted along its shoulders and chest, and a thin cut above its left eye that had crusted over with cold. But none of that touched whatever it was carrying in its posture. It stood with its weight evenly distributed, head level, not lowered in submission the way the others had been when they first came in. Not raised in aggression either, just steady. Deliberate, like it had made a considered decision to be exactly where it was. And those eyes, gold, not the pale amber I had seen in wildlife photographs or the reflective silver-white the other wolves threw back at my flashlight. This was a deep, clear, almost warm gold, and it was aimed at me with a focus that made the towel in my hands feel suddenly insufficient as a prop. I became very aware that I was kneeling on my kitchen floor at roughly the same height as its chest. I straightened up slowly, not fast enough to read as threat, not slow enough to read as fear. Somewhere in the middle, which was the best I could manage, given that my pulse had made a unilateral decision to relocate to my throat. "Hi," I said. The wolf did not blink. "Okay," I said, "we are doing silence. That is fine." I turned back to the wolf nearest me on the floor, a pale grey one that had been the most touch-tolerant of the group, and continued working. Warm water, towel, slow steady pressure along the spine where the cold tended to settle deepest. And I kept my movements the same as they had been before the black wolf appeared. Deliberate, calm, completely at odds with what was happening behind my sternum. I could feel it watching me, not the ambient awareness of an animal tracking movement in its environment. This was different, directional, sustained, the kind of attention that has weight to it, that you feel on the side of your face the same way you feel sunlight or the edge of someone standing too close. I had spent the last hour in a kitchen full of wolves and had not felt anything like it once. It started the moment those gold eyes found me, and it had not shifted. I finished with the grey wolf and moved to the next one, a darker animal that had been breathing too shallowly when I brought it in. Better now, ribs rising and falling in a steadier rhythm. I exhaled something I had not realized I was holding. When I sat back on my heels and reached for the water bowl, I found it empty. I stood to refill it at the sink, and in doing so, I turned my back to the room. Every instinct I had lit up like a circuit board at exactly the same moment. I filled the bowl. I counted to 3. I turned back around. The black wolf had moved. It was closer now, maybe 8 feet instead of 14, and it had settled into a low resting position, front legs extended, head still up. It had not moved toward me aggressively. It had simply closed the distance while my back was turned and then arranged itself like it had always been there and had no particular opinion about the matter. My heart did something complicated. "You know," I said, keeping my voice even as I crossed back to my spot on the floor, "most people knock." One ear moved. A single small rotation toward my voice. I chose to interpret that as engagement. I worked through the remaining wolves over the next stretch of time that I could not accurately measure. The candles had burned down to their second hour. The storm outside was still going, still audible through the walls, but it had lost some of its violence, settling into the long, steady, sustained cold that followed the initial assault. The kind that was in some ways more dangerous because it was patient. The wolves were warming up. I could see it in the incremental changes, a tail that began to move, slowly, side to side, a head that lifted and then rested on the back of a packmate, and 2 near the hallway who had pressed so tightly together when they came in that I had initially counted them as 1 and had to revise my total. They were breathing in sync now, which was either deeply comforting or deeply unsettling, and I had not yet decided which. I sat back against the cabinet under the sink and let myself stop moving for the first time in what felt like hours. My arms ached, my knees ached. My lower back had escalated from a formal complaint to a full grievance filing. I was still wearing my coat over a blanket because I had not had a free moment to take either off, and I was aware that I looked exactly as ridiculous as that sounded. The black wolf's eyes found mine across the room. I looked back. This close, with the candlelight doing what candlelight does to the dark, and there was something almost unbearable about its gaze. Not threatening, not soft either, just intensely present in a way that made me feel, for reasons I had no rational framework for, like I was being seen very clearly by something that understood more than it was letting on. "I don't know what you are," I said quietly, "but you are different from the others." It held my gaze for another long, unhurried moment. Then it lowered its head and rested its chin on its front paws. Not away from me. Toward me. I watched it sleep, or whatever the black wolf was doing. Its eyes were closed, its breathing had slowed, and its chin was still resting on its front paws in that deliberate, almost architectural way it had settled into. But even in stillness, it had a quality the others did not. The others slept the way exhausted animals sleep, I completely surrendering every muscle to the floor. This one rested like it was making a choice, like sleep was something it was allowing rather than something that had taken it. I was aware that I was anthropomorphizing a wolf. I was also aware that I had been awake for going on 19 hours, was sitting on a kitchen floor surrounded by 15 animals that did not belong in my house, and had developed what could only be described as a complicated feeling about one specific set of gold eyes. So anthropomorphizing felt like a relatively minor concern on the current list. I pulled my coat tighter and leaned my head back against the cabinet. The candles were low. 2 had gone out entirely, leaving the kitchen in a dimmer, warmer light that softened everything at the edges. The storm had dropped further into that long, a grinding cold I had anticipated, steady and deep and settled. Not violent anymore, just permanent feeling, the way Vermont winters got when they stopped performing and started simply existing. My body made a strong and well-reasoned argument for closing my eyes. I told it we were not doing that. I lost that argument sometime around what I estimated was 3 in the morning. I did not intend to sleep. I know that is exactly what a person says before they fall asleep, sitting up against a kitchen cabinet with a blanket over their coat and a room full of wolves. But I genuinely did not intend to. What happened was that the particular quality of silence in the room shifted from alert to something softer, and the warmth that had built up from the stove and the collective body heat of 15 large animals created a specific atmospheric condition that was, medically speaking, incompatible with staying awake. I was out within minutes. What woke me was warmth, specific, directional, close warmth, not the ambient kind from the room, the kind that has a source. I registered it before I registered anything else, before I opened my eyes, before I remembered where I was, or why every muscle below my waist had filed for emancipation from my skeleton. Just warmth, pressed against my left side, from shoulder to hip, steady and deep and breathing. I opened my eyes. The black wolf was beside me. Not near me. Beside me. It had moved from its position across the room at some point while I was asleep and settled itself directly against my left side. In its body aligned with mine, its head resting forward on its paws at roughly the level of my knee. The top of its back was pressed against my arm and shoulder with a comfortable matter-of-fact solidity, like it had decided this was simply where it was going to be and had no follow-up questions about that decision. I did not move. My brain ran through several responses in quick succession and discarded all of them. The first was alarm, which lasted approximately 2 seconds before my nervous system clocked that I was not hurt and the wolf was not tense. The second was confusion, which was more durable but also not particularly actionable. The third was something I did not have a clean label for, something that settled in my chest and stayed there, warm and slightly inconvenient. I looked down at it. The candlelight was very low now, and 2 stubs guttering on the counter, and in that near dark, The black of its fur absorbed everything and gave back nothing except the faint outline of its shape against my side and the slow, visible rhythm of its breathing. One of its ears was angled slightly back, not flat, not frightened, just relaxed in the specific way that meant it was aware of me and unbothered by that awareness. I became conscious of the fact that my left hand was resting on its back. I did not remember putting it there. I left it there. "Okay," I said, very quietly, to the top of its head. "I see how it is." Its ear moved. I exhaled slowly and let my head tip back against the cabinet again, not closing my eyes this time, just resting. The kitchen was quiet in a way it had not been since before the storm. The other wolves were breathing, shifting occasionally, the soft sounds of large animals in collective rest. Outside, the wind had dropped to something that was almost gentle, which in Vermont at this time of year counted as a peace offering. I thought about what I was going to do in the morning. The power would need to come back on. The wolves would need to go back to wherever they had come from. I would need to call the wildlife authority and explain, in terms that did not make me sound either unhinged or criminally reckless, why I currently had 15 wolves in my house. That was going to be a memorable conversation. I thought about the black one. I thought about the way it had watched me work, the way it had closed the distance while my back was turned and arranged itself like it had always belonged in that corner, the way it had crossed the room while I slept and pressed itself against my side without waking me, which should have felt alarming and instead felt like the most natural thing that had happened all night. I thought about gold eyes that held attention like they meant something by it. My hand pressed slightly deeper into the fur beneath it. Not consciously, just a small involuntary increase in pressure, the kind the body makes when it is confirming something real. The wolf exhaled, long and slow and even, and outside for the first time in hours. The snow stopped, and everything that had felt temporary suddenly felt permanent. I noticed it the way you notice a sound you did not realize was constant until it disappears. The wind had been running underneath everything all night. A background pressure I had stopped registering hours ago, and when it went quiet, the silence it left behind had a different texture entirely. Fuller, heavier, like the world outside had exhaled and was now just sitting with whatever it had done. I sat with it too. My hand was still on the black wolf's back. I was still on the kitchen floor. My spine had several urgent things to say about both of those facts, and I acknowledged them and did nothing about either. The wolf's breathing was slow and even under my palm, its rib cage expanding and contracting in a rhythm that was, I noticed with the detached observation of someone running on no sleep, slightly slower than I would have expected. Not concerning, just deliberate, like everything else about it. The kitchen was grey with early light by the time I finally moved. Not dawn, not yet. But the particular pre-dawn grey that comes in through windows before the sun has committed to anything. It turned everything in the room into shapes and shadows, softening the edges of the wolves on my floor into something that looked, in that light, almost peaceful, almost like a thing that could have been planned. I shifted my weight carefully, trying to stand without disturbing the black wolf against my side. It was awake before I had completed the first movement. Not startled awake, just awake, the way it had been sleeping, as a choice. Its head lifted from its paws, and those gold eyes opened and found me immediately, with the kind of orientation that did not require adjustment or searching. It simply looked at me, already knowing where I was. I froze halfway through standing, one hand braced on the cabinet, the other still warm from contact with its fur. "Morning," I said. It held my gaze for a moment that lasted a beat longer than necessary. Then it stood in one fluid movement that made absolutely no noise at all, and took one step back to give me room. I finished standing. My knees registered their formal objections. I ignored them and moved to the stove to check the water situation, which was cold and needed addressing, and to do something with my hands that was not running them through my hair while staring at a wolf who looked at me like I owed it an explanation. I got the stove going again. I refilled the largest pot. I stood with my back to the room and listened to the sounds behind me. The shift of large bodies waking up, the soft exhales. Two of the wolves near the hallway making low sounds at each other that were almost conversational. And underneath all of it, closer than the others, the quiet, steady presence of the black one. I could feel it without turning around, that same directional weight it had carried all night. That specific quality of attention that had no animal equivalent I could access in the part of my brain that was supposed to be handling this rationally. I turned around. It was sitting 3 feet away, watching me with its chin level and its ears forward, and the full force of those gold eyes directed at my face like it was reading something there. "You need to stop doing that," I told it. It did not stop doing that. I crouched down to check the wolf nearest the hallway, a darker grey animal that had been the most critical when I brought it in. Its breathing was strong now, fully normalized, and when my hand touched its side, it lifted its head and made a sound that was neither threatening nor distressed. Just acknowledgement. I exhaled something I had been holding since about 11 the previous night. "You're okay," I said quietly, and I meant it for the room generally and also specifically for myself. I worked my way through the kitchen, checking each wolf methodically, and the black one tracked every movement I made without following me. It stayed in its position near the stove and simply turned as I moved, that gold gaze maintaining its line to me with a consistency that was starting to feel less like animal behavior and more like something I did not have a category for. By the time I had checked the last wolf, the light through the kitchen window had shifted from grey to the pale thin gold of actual morning, and I could see the yard through the glass for the first time since the night before. The snow had buried everything. The storage benches I had dragged against the fence were barely visible, just 2 rectangular suggestions under a uniform white surface. Beyond the fence, the tree line was transformed, every branch carrying its own weight of snow, the whole landscape rendered in white and dark grey, and the pale yellow of the morning light coming in low from the east. The 5 wolves I had sheltered outside were at the back door, all 5 standing in a loose cluster on the buried porch, looking through the glass with the patient, uncomplicated directness of animals who had decided the arrangement from last night should continue. I looked at them. I looked at my kitchen, which contained 10 wolves, and was already at capacity by any reasonable definition of the word. I looked back at the 5 outside, then I felt it. The black wolf had moved to stand beside me at the window, close enough that its shoulder was level with my hip, close enough that I could feel the warmth of it against my leg. It looked through the glass at the 5 wolves outside. Then it looked up at me. The question was unmistakable. "Don't," I said. "Do not look at me like that." It kept looking at me like that. I opened the back door. The 5 wolves came in like they had been waiting for permission and were mildly annoyed it took so long. They moved past me in a loose single file, shaking snow from their coats as they cleared the threshold, each one pausing briefly in the doorway to take in the room before continuing forward. The kitchen, which had already exceeded any reasonable definition of capacity, absorbed them with the particular indifference of a space that had already committed to being extraordinary. I closed the door behind the last one, 15 wolves, in my house, in Ashford, Vermont, on a Tuesday. I stood with my back against the door and looked at what I had done and felt, in equal measure, a profound sense of accomplishment and the specific variety of exhaustion that comes from having made a series of correct decisions that were also completely insane. The black wolf was still beside me. It had not moved from my side when I opened the door, had not gone to the others when they filed in. It stood with its shoulder at my hip and watched the room settle with the same calm authority it had carried all night. And when the last wolf found its space on my living room floor and the movement stopped, it turned and looked up at me. "Don't thank me," I said. "This is a temporary arrangement." Its ear rotated toward my voice. "I mean it. I'm calling wildlife services when my phone gets signal back, and this is going to become their problem in a very organized and responsible way." It held my gaze. "You are very easy to talk to," I told it. "That is not a compliment. That is a symptom of sleep deprivation." I pushed off the door and crossed to the counter, stepping carefully around 2 wolves who had arranged themselves directly in the center of the kitchen floor with the spatial awareness of animals who had never heard of traffic flow. I found my phone on the counter where I had left it the night before. The screen showed 4% battery and exactly 0 signal bars. "Perfect," I said, to no one. I plugged it into the wall outlet out of habit and then remembered the power was still out, and unplugged it and set it back down. The black wolf had followed me to the counter, not obtrusively, not underfoot. It had simply relocated to a position approximately 3 feet to my left, where it sat with its weight settled back on its haunches and observed me with the attentive patience of someone who had nowhere else to be and found my company adequately interesting. I looked at it sideways. "Do you want breakfast?" I asked, because I have half a rotisserie chicken in the refrigerator and genuinely no idea what the protocol is here. I opened the refrigerator. The cold inside was at this point barely distinguishable from the cold outside, which meant everything in it was still fine. I found the chicken, a block of cheddar I had no context for giving to a wolf, 3 eggs, and the specific kind of sparse refrigerator contents that confirmed I had been meaning to go grocery shopping for approximately 4 days. I pulled out the chicken. The response from the room was immediate and unanimous. Every wolf that had been in various states of rest went alert at once. Heads up, ears forward, noses working. The 2 blocking the kitchen floor stood up, and the ones in the hallway craned their heads around the corner. "Okay," I said. "Okay, everyone stay calm. There is enough." There was not enough. The chicken was a regular-sized rotisserie chicken, which was sufficient for one person's dinner and one person's lunch the following day, and was absolutely not sufficient for 15 wolves who had spent the night surviving a blizzard. I knew this. I proceeded anyway, because the alternative was doing nothing, and doing nothing had never once felt like a real option to me. I pulled the chicken apart on the cutting board and divided it as evenly as I could manage into portions that were, objectively, embarrassingly small. I set them out across the kitchen floor in a loose spread, trying to create enough distance between portions that no one had to fight for space. The wolves ate with the focused efficiency of animals who understood that what was available was what there was. No aggression, no posturing, just the quiet, serious business of eating, which was, in its own way, one of the more moving things I had witnessed in a long time. The black wolf did not go to any of the portions I had set out. I noticed that with a specific sideways awareness that I was not going to examine too closely. I looked at the cutting board, where the last section of chicken sat. I looked at the black wolf, which was sitting 3 feet away, not looking at the food at all. Looking at me. I picked up the last portion and held it out. It did not move immediately. It looked at my hand, then back at my face, with an evaluating quality that was doing genuinely unreasonable things to my nervous system for reasons I refused to itemize at this time. Then it moved forward, slowly, and took the piece of chicken from my hand with a precision that was almost careful, almost deliberate in its gentleness. Its nose brushed my fingers, warm, brief, completely incidental. My hand stayed where it was for a moment after, open, empty, still feeling the ghost of that contact against my fingertips. I closed my hand slowly. "Right," I said very quietly. "Okay then." Outside in the distance, I heard the first sound that had come from the direction of town since the storm began. An engine, a plough, working its way up the main road. The world was starting to come back online. And I was standing in my kitchen with chicken grease on my fingers and a feeling in my chest I had absolutely no framework for. The plough sound grew louder, then steadier, then close enough that I could hear the scrape of the blade against asphalt beneath the snow. I wiped my hand on a dish towel and stood at the kitchen window, watching the road come back into visibility, inch by inch, as the plough worked its way up the block. The morning light had strengthened while I was not paying attention, shifting from that thin, pale gold into something with actual conviction behind it. It caught the snow in the yard and made it look intentional, decorative almost, like someone had arranged it. My phone buzzed on the counter. I grabbed it so fast I nearly knocked it into the sink. 1 bar, flickering, unstable, but present. The battery was at 3%, which meant I had approximately 1 phone call worth of time before it became an expensive paperweight, and I needed to use it intelligently. I called the Vermont Wildlife Authority. The hold music was the acoustic guitar arrangement that had no business being as calming as it was given the current situation. I stood with the phone pressed to my ear and watched the black wolf watch me from its position near the kitchen island. And I thought about what I was going to say, and I concluded that there was no version of this conversation that was going to sound fully credible. Someone picked up. "Vermont Wildlife, this is Dale." "Hi, Dale," I said. "My name is Callum Reid. I live on Birchwood Lane in Ashford. I have 15 wolves in my house." A pause. "Sir, did you say 15? "I did. They came in during the storm last night. Several were hypothermic. I brought them inside to prevent fatalities. They are stable now, but I need guidance on next steps because I work in data analysis and this is genuinely outside my area." Another pause, longer this time. "You brought 15 wolves inside your house?" "Yes, voluntarily." "Dale, I understand how this sounds. Can you send someone?" He sent someone. Two someones, as it turned out, which I appreciated because the look on the face of the first wildlife officer when she opened my front door and saw the interior of my house was the kind of expression that benefited from a witness. Her name was Officer Tran, and she stood in my doorway for a solid 4 seconds without speaking. Her eyes moving from the 2 wolves in the hallway to the 3 visible in the living room, to the general wolf-shaped situation throughout, and then she looked at me. "Mr. Reid." "I know," I said. I know. How are they all just sitting there?" "Yes, I don't fully understand it either." Her partner came in behind her, a younger guy whose name tag said Marsh, and he made a sound that was not quite a word when he cleared the doorway and got the full picture. Officer Tran pulled out her radio and said several things into it that I could tell were being phrased carefully for the record. She moved through the house with the measured, professional calm of someone who had dealt with unusual situations before, though I suspected not quite this particular configuration. She checked each wolf, assessed condition, made notes. She was thorough and efficient and only paused once when she reached the kitchen and the black wolf looked at her. She looked back at it for a moment. Then she looked at me. "This one yours?" "No," I said. "None of them are mine. It's looking at you like it belongs to you." I did not have a response to that. I made a sound that was technically a response and moved on. The assessment took 40 minutes. By the end of it, Officer Tran had confirmed that all 15 wolves were members of a pack whose territory covered the ridge system north of Ashford, a pack that had been tracked and monitored for 2 seasons. They had been pushed south by the storm, further than wolves typically moved, and the conditions had deteriorated faster than the pack could manage. "You probably saved most of them," she said, or standing in my kitchen with her notebook open. "The ones you brought in first were the worst off. Another 2-3 hours in those temperatures." She did not finish the sentence. I looked at the floor. "We'll need to transport them back to the ridge," she continued. "We have the vehicles for it. It'll take a few trips." She paused. "The black one is going to be a separate conversation." I looked up. "What do you mean?" She hesitated in the specific way that professionals hesitate when they are deciding how much to tell a civilian. "That animal isn't part of the monitored pack. No tag, no prior record in our system. The pack defers to it, which is interesting, but we have no data on where it came from or how long it's been in the area." She made a note. "We'll need to assess it separately. Possible relocation depending on what we find." The word relocation landed somewhere it should not have. I kept my face neutral. What does that mean, relocation? Could mean a lot of things. Could mean moving it to a different territory. Could mean a facility if it doesn't fit with the existing pack dynamic. She said it the way you say things that are procedurally true and humanly uncomfortable. I looked at the black wolf. It was looking at me. Not at Officer Tran, who was 3 feet closer to it. Not at the door, which was open. At me, with those gold eyes carrying the same steady, considering weight they had carried since the moment I first saw them reflected in candlelight in the corner of my kitchen. My jaw tightened. "Is there a timeline on that assessment?" I asked. Officer Tran looked at me with the expression of someone recalibrating their read on a situation. "Why?" she asked. I did not answer immediately. I looked at the black wolf one more moment, then back at her. "Just asking," I said, but we both knew I was not just asking. Officer Tran looked at me for a moment longer than was strictly professional. She had the kind of eyes that did not miss much, dark and steady, and practiced at reading the gap between what people said and what they meant. I had been straightforward with her about everything since she arrived. The timeline, the conditions, the decisions I made, and why. I had not embellished or minimized. I was a data person. I dealt inaccurate information, but I was also standing in my kitchen looking at a wolf that had no record in any system, facing the word relocation, and not saying the thing I was very clearly thinking. She made a note. She did not push. "We'll start transport on the pack," she said, moving toward the hallway. "Marsh will coordinate the vehicles. The untagged animal stays until we complete the primary transfer and I can make some calls." "Understood," I said. She gave me one more look, brief and unreadable, and then she moved into the living room, and the process of dismantling the night began. It took longer than I expected and was more logistically complicated than I had the bandwidth to fully process. The transport crates had to be brought around to the back, which meant clearing a path through the yard, which meant Marsh spending 20 minutes with a shovel while Officer Tran coordinated with whoever was on the other end of her radio. The wolves went with a cooperation that continued to strike me as remarkable. Not eager, not distressed, just measured. Each one assessed, logged, crated, and loaded with the specific calm of animals that had made a decision about whether to trust and were following through on it. I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hallway and watched it happen and felt, with each crate that was carried out, a specific reduction in the weight of the room. The black wolf did not move through any of it. It stayed in the kitchen, not hiding, not tense, just present in its particular way, tracking the activity in the house with those gold eyes and returning at intervals to me. Every time I shifted position, it recalibrated. Every time I looked at it, it was already looking back. And the consistency of that should have been less affecting than it was. I was aware of this and filed it under things to examine later, when I had slept and eaten and had access to the full range of my cognitive resources. The last of the pack went into a crate around 9:15. The house, minus 14 wolves, felt enormous. Marsh came back through the kitchen to gather the remaining equipment and paused when he saw the black wolf still sitting beside the island. He looked at it, then at me, with the expression of someone doing arithmetic. "Tran's making calls," he said. "Probably another hour before she has direction on this one." "Okay," I said. He lingered. "You doing all right?" That was a lot. "I'm fine," I said, which was mostly true. "Little tired." "Yeah, I imagine." He looked at the wolf again. "It really hasn't moved from that spot. It moves. It just—" I stopped. "It stays close." Marsh nodded slowly with the energy of a man deciding not to have a particular thought out loud. He picked up his equipment bag and went back outside. I turned to the black wolf. We were alone in the house for the first time since before the storm. 14 wolves gone, Officer Tran outside on her radio, Marsh loading equipment. Just me and the kitchen and the quiet and those gold eyes. I crossed to the island and leaned against it, facing the wolf, my arms folded loosely across my chest. "So," I said, "what happens to you?" It looked at me. "Facility is what she said, if you don't fit the pack dynamic." I kept my voice even, which is a very clean way of saying something that isn't clean at all. The wolf's ear moved toward my voice. That small rotation I had been cataloguing all night without meaning to. "I don't know what you are," I said, which was the same thing I had said in Act 3 in the dark and the candlelight, and it was still true and still felt insufficient. "I know what the data says you should be. Pack animal, territory-driven, threat-averse around humans, no sustained voluntary proximity without conditioning." I paused. "You have violated approximately every one of those parameters since the moment you walked through my door." The wolf stood up, not away, toward me. It crossed the 3 feet between us in 2 unhurried steps and stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I could see the individual texture of its fur, the healed cut above its left eye, and the particular quality of intelligence in its gaze that I had been refusing to name since approximately midnight. My arms unfolded, my hands dropped to my sides, it lifted its head and pressed its nose against my sternum. Light pressure, just enough to feel. My breath left me, not from surprise, from the specific sensation of something landing exactly where it was aimed, the way a key sounds when it finds the right lock. I stood with my back against the island and my hands at my sides and a wolf pressing its nose against my chest, and I felt something I had been carefully not identifying since the moment those gold eyes found me across a candlelit kitchen. I raised my right hand and pressed it flat against the top of its head. "I am going to make a phone call," I said quietly, "and ask a lot of annoying logistical questions." Its tail moved, once, slow. "That is not a promise," I said. "That is just what comes next." But my hand stayed where it was, warm and steady against its fur, and outside I could hear Officer Tran's voice on the radio, and I was already thinking about what I was going to say. Officer Tran came back inside 12 minutes later. I know it was 12 minutes because I counted them. Not obsessively, just with the specific awareness of someone who has made a decision and is waiting for the moment to say it out loud, which turns ordinary time into something you measure. I was still in the kitchen. The black wolf was still beside me. My hand had moved from its head to the counter, but the distance between us had not changed. 3 inches, maybe. The kind of distance that is not accidental. Officer Tran came through the back door, stamped snow from her boots, and read the room in approximately 1 second. She pulled out her notebook. "I made 4 calls," she said. "No record of this animal in any regional database. No tag, no prior capture, no pack assignment." She looked at the wolf, then at me. "Which means jurisdiction is complicated and protocol gives us some flexibility on placement." "How much flexibility?" I said. She looked at me steadily, enough that a licensed wildlife foster with appropriate property, documented competency, and a credible case for behavioral compatibility could apply for a temporary residential placement pending full assessment. She paused. "Temporary, reviewed at 90 days. The wolf's tail moved in my peripheral vision. "What counts as documented competency?" I said. "Professional background in wildlife biology or data, property assessment, home visit." She almost smiled. "And a demonstrated history of the animal exhibiting voluntary non-aggressive proximity to the applicant." I looked around my kitchen, at the water bowls still on the floor, at the towels piled by the hallway, at the very evident, extensively documented history of a wolf that had spent the entire night pressing itself against my side. "I work in wildlife data analysis," I said. "I have 2 acres including the yard, and I think we have the proximity question covered." Officer Tran looked at the wolf one more time. It was sitting beside me with its shoulder against my leg and its gold eyes on her face, with the calm, direct attention it applied to everything. "Fill out the application," she said. "Ma, I'll expedite the property review." She made a note. 90 days, Mr. Reid. After that, we reassess." 90 days, I agreed. She clicked her pen closed and looked at me with something that was not quite a smile and not quite professionalism, and lived in the honest space between them. "You know, most people who find a wolf in their yard call us first and ask questions later." "I'm aware," I said. "What made you open the door?" I thought about it. About the sound of scratching on wood in a storm, about the specific quality of desperation in a rhythm that was not random, about the decision my body made before my brain finished the sentence. "It asked," I said. She held my gaze for a moment, then she put her notebook away, told me the application would be in my email by end of day, and walked back out through the door. I listened to the sound of the wildlife vehicle pulling away from the curb, then the sound of Marsh's truck, then nothing. Just the house and the quiet and the particular texture of a morning that had come through something and arrived on the other side. I looked down at the black wolf. It looked up at me. 90 days, I said. That is what we have officially. After that, I will argue with anyone who has an opinion about it. Its ear rotated toward my voice. "I'm going to need to name you," I said. "I cannot keep calling you the black wolf in my own head. It is getting grammatically complicated." I looked at it for a long moment, at the gold eyes and the dark fur and the cut above its left eye that was already healing, at the particular quality of its attention, steady and deep and patient in a way that had felt, and from the very first moment, like something that understood more than it was showing. "Orion," I said, "because you showed up in the middle of a storm and you have been navigating by something I can't see ever since." The wolf, Orion, held my gaze. Then he stepped forward and pressed his forehead against my sternum, the same way he had before, that same light, deliberate pressure, and this time I did not wait. I brought both hands up and held his head carefully. The way you hold something you are still learning the weight of. And I stood in my kitchen in the wreckage of the strangest night of my life, and felt something settle in my chest that I did not have a clean name for yet. I was going to learn it. I had 90 days to start. I made coffee. Real coffee, because the power had come back on sometime during the transport, on blinking back into the house with the particular indifference of utility infrastructure that has no awareness of narrative timing. I made enough for one person, which was the correct amount, and I stood at the counter drinking it while Orion lay on the kitchen floor in the thin morning light that came through the window and watched me with those gold eyes. I watched him back. I thought about the scratching at the door, about the moment I opened it and found something half frozen and still standing, about every decision I had made between that moment and this one, each one irrational by every metric I had been trained to apply and correct, in every way that did not fit neatly into a spreadsheet. My laptop was still dead on the living room floor. My back still ached from the night on the tile. I had 7 wet towels to launder, in a groceries list that now needed to account for a wolf, and a 90-day application to complete before 5 o'clock. I was, by any objective measure, in significantly more complicated circumstances than I had been 24 hours ago. I finished my coffee. Orion's tail moved once, slow and certain, against the kitchen floor. I set down my mug and smiled, for the first time since before the storm, with my whole face. "All right," I said. "Let's figure out what comes next." Thank you so much for watching Moonlight BL Tales. If this story touched your heart, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more emotional BL romance stories. See you in the next story.